Let's expand on this discussion. To speak to us on the importance of employing people living with disabilities, we're joined by Vice Chairperson of South African Employers for Disability, Hannetjie Hock. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, just listening to what has been said in that package before you and I even spoke, a lot of emphasis on questions around how workplaces should be more adaptable. I mean, we hear a person living with a disability speaking about the challenge of load shedding, saying that when that happens and people are leaving the building, there are no other options for him. What's your thoughts? What are your views on how workplaces can be more adaptable?
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on this important topic. So yes, as we've heard in the clip, it is so disheartening, but it is a fact. People with disabilities are the most vulnerable, the least represented in our workplaces. It is a fact that transportation and accessibility to get to the workplace is an issue, and then once you get to the workplace, moving around within the workplace is also an issue. What employers can do, first and utmost, some of your clips refer to it as well in terms of what can be done. You know, it's one thing to look at what the workplaces can do, but the problem is far greater. It stems from grassroots upwards. So from basic education, we've got people with disabilities, children with disabilities, that's not getting those equal opportunities to get even a basic education. To get mainstream access to education for people with disabilities, it's non-heard of unless you've got the funds to be able to afford it, and unfortunately that's not the majority of society. So hence what happens is, with a lack of education, how do you even consider entering the workplace? A lot of children with disabilities in our country only get educated up to grade 4 level, and then they need to go into skills programs. Some of them, it works, they can sustain themselves, but a large portion still, unfortunately, aren't getting the opportunities. Yeah. So what can employers do? Well, definitely it starts with education, creating awareness. It's a reality that there's two sides to the problem here, and if I could call it a problem. Currently, the representativity of people with disability in our workplaces, based on stats and the Annual Employment Equity Commission report, shows that on some levels you're looking at 1.3%, 1.7% representation. However, if you look back at a good couple of years back, I think it was around 2011, where statistics, the census showed that already then over 7% of society are people with disabilities. So what must we do? So apart from basic education, and yes, it takes funding to make sure that from grassroots level up, that children do get the right education to get those opportunities. The other thing then, when it gets to the workplace, what employers can do is, first and utmost, currently in terms of BEE, a lot of companies are tapping into learnerships. So thanks to the BEE Act, a lot of companies are focusing on bringing in youth with disabilities. Yeah. The benefit
Perhaps,
of that
if you'll allow me, just taking a look at how much work the country's education officials are doing insofar as consideration around the plight of children with disabilities, because we know that this would then translate into a bigger hindrance to enabling the successful integration of persons living with disabilities, both in the workplace and, of course, society at large.
Yeah, so again, funding, infrastructure, and obviously the right educators. Now, I know there's a lot of our sectors of government and non-profits working on this ground to try and make things better, but a lot more needs to be done. And that's just one aspect. So let's look back at the workplace. So currently you're adults living with disabilities. What can employers do? So in terms of creating awareness in the workplace, accessibility, but it's twofold as well. It's creating awareness for people with disabilities and people without, because there needs to be understanding, there needs to be knowledge. How do we treat each other? How do we relate to each other? We've heard earlier about treating each other with dignity and respect. That's a constitutional right for all of us. but yet people with disabilities being the most vulnerable, a lot of people with disabilities don't go to interviews or don't disclose if it's non-visible because of fear of being victimized or mistreated. So how do we overcome that? Through education. Education, not just in workplaces, but also from non-profits such as the organization that I represent. So even though we work with employers, a lot of what we do is also out to the general community. So being at career days for people with disabilities, looking at that as to how we can aid. But a key thing also is, if I could take it a bit more specific in the workplaces, so definitely health and safety is a key concern, and that it's a concern for all, but the fact that people with disabilities are in buildings where there's no proper arrangements made to ensure the safety of those individuals is really a great concern. So where do you start? Well, every employer has a duty to make sure that your workplace is safe. And if not having the internal knowledge of how to do that, then tap into specialists that can come in and do a risk assessment for you to see what are the risks and how can you cater for people with disabilities. The other thing also I want to say in how we can integrate people with disabilities better is that employers can actually take a look at the different positions within the organization to see where can they actually cater for more people with disabilities, what can be done to accommodate. And yes, sometimes it's transportation, sometimes it's accessibility for people
while you're on
in wheelchairs.
transportation, Hannetjie, we know that at Transport Summit, which was held last month, we heard President Cyril Ramaphosa acknowledging that there are still many areas where a lot of work is needed to make the national transport system fully accessible, to ensure accessibility for persons with disabilities. Where do you think government continues to miss the mark? Because there is enabling legislation.
There is enabling legislation, but I think it's also twofold. Government can't do it on their own. You've got a lot of private-owned transport. So public transport is one, and that takes funding, and that takes a committed strategy to make it happen. But it's not just government's problem. It's also the rest of society, the rest of sector. So every single person involved in any form of transport and where you're licensed to transport people should also take ownership. The other thing is also, again, through organizations such as ourselves with a focus on people with disabilities, is to tap into the right organizations perhaps to help and guide to see how do you create a better infrastructure. The reality is the current public transport system, yes, cannot cater for people with disabilities. Anybody who's in a wheelchair or on crutches, the most unfortunate part is that unless you've got somebody who's going to give you a helping hand, or you've got, and I'm not talking about our buses, I'm now even talking about our taxis, unless you've got a taxi driver who would give the time to actually wait a little bit longer, make the space to allow that person in, is not going to happen. So unfortunately, the challenge we have to properly integrate people with disabilities, not just in our workplaces, but also with dignity and respect in our society, is not just government's problem. Yes, there's a large responsibility on government there, and yes, funding plays a big part, but government on their own cannot do it.
Yeah. Very well. Thank you so much for weighing in on this discussion. Hannetjie Hock, who is the Vice Chairperson of South African Employers for Disability, just weighing in on that conversation.